The turning point. The studio lights blazed intensely at America's most-watched primetime talk show, Night Talk with Jason Mitchell. The atmosphere crackled with tension as J.D. Vance, the newly inaugurated vice president, stepped onto the set. Fresh from taking his oath of office, Vance carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. Jason Mitchell, the show's veteran host, had other plans. Known for his razor-sharp tongue and liberal leanings, Mitchell had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Though his producer had promised a respectful discussion about the new administration, the glint in Mitchell's eyes told a different story. As Vance took his seat, the usual pre-interview pleasantries felt rushed and mechanical. Mitchell's smile never quite reached his eyes, and the production team seemed unusually tense. Something was off. Vance, drawing on his Marine Corps background, could sense an ambush coming. Years of military training had taught him to read rooms like this, and right now every instinct was telling him that Mitchell had loaded his questions with carefully hidden landmines. "Mr. Vice President," Mitchell began, his voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "let's talk about your remarkable journey from Trump critic to his second-in-command." Vance smiled, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of someone who'd grown from life's challenges. "You know, Jason, that's actually a perfect place to start because it speaks to something bigger than just politics. It speaks to the American capacity for growth and understanding." The audience leaned forward slightly. This wasn't the defensive response Mitchell had expected. The host shifted in his chair, his prepared follow-up suddenly feeling less potent. "Growth and understanding?" Mitchell's tone carried a hint of mockery. "Is that what we're calling it now? Because some might say it's more about political convenience." "You see, Jason," Vance replied, his voice steady and clear, "in America, we have this incredible tradition of being able to change our minds when presented with new information. When I criticized President Trump years ago, I was looking at things through a narrow lens. But then I saw something remarkable. I saw how his policies were actually helping the forgotten Americans I wrote about in my book." The exchange continued to heat up as Mitchell attempted to corner Vance on various issues: his faith, his background, his apparent political transformation. But with each calculated attack, Vance responded with measured wisdom and unwavering conviction. As the interview intensified, Mitchell pulled out what he thought would be his trump card. "Let's discuss your recent speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. You spoke about divine guidance in government decisions. Don't you think that's a dangerous mixing of church and state?" The audience tensed. Mitchell had just stepped onto sacred ground, and the glint in Vance's eyes suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of challenge. "Divine guidance, Jason." Vance leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. What I actually said was that our founding fathers understood the importance of moral guidance in leadership. They weren't afraid of faith. They were afraid of tyranny." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. Mitchell's jaw tightened, but before he could interject, Vance continued. "When I was a Marine, nobody questioned our chaplain's presence. Nobody complained when we prayed before missions because, in those moments of truth, even the skeptics understand there's something deeper than politics." Mitchell's face flushed as he shuffled his notes. "Let's move on to your relationship with President Trump. Your recent statement about him being God's instrument for America's renewal. Don't you think that's a bit extreme?" "What I think is extreme," Vance replied, his calm demeanor unchanged, "is how some in the media seem more concerned about a leader who prays than about policies that hurt American families." "But surely," Mitchell pressed, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "a man of your intellectual background must see the contradiction in supporting someone you once criticized." "There you go again, Jason," Vance replied calmly. "You're so focused on trying to find contradictions that you're missing the point entirely. The real contradiction would be ignoring what I've seen with my own eyes just to please critics like yourself." The audience erupted in thunderous applause. Mitchell glanced nervously at his producer, who was making frantic gestures from the sidelines. "My coverage," Mitchell's voice rose slightly. "Oh, but we are," Vance interjected smoothly, "because just last week you spent an entire segment questioning my faith, suggesting it was, what did you call it? Ah, yes, convenient election season Christianity." Mitchell's face reddened. I was merely pointing out the timing. The timing of what exactly? Vance leaned forward. The fact that I've been attending the same church since before I entered politics? Or maybe you'd like to question my grandmother's faith too. The woman who taught me to pray before every meal, even when we barely had food on the table. A woman in the front row nodded vigorously, and several audience members called out in support. The tension in the studio reached a fever pitch as Mitchell tried desperately to regain control. Let's move on to your recent statements. Yes, let's talk about statements, Vance agreed, his voice carrying both strength and dignity. Like your statement last month suggesting that anyone who supports traditional values is living in the past? Tell me, Jason, do you think the millions of Americans who go to church every Sunday, who believe in family values, who love their country, are they all just living in the past? The silence in the studio was deafening. Mitchell's carefully crafted persona was crumbling with each passing moment. You invited me here thinking you could shame me for my beliefs, my background, my support for the president, Vance continued. But let's talk about what really bothers you. He paused, letting his words sink in. It bothers you that someone can come from where I came from and not subscribe to your worldview. It bothers you that I can be educated at Yale Law School and still believe in traditional values. Most of all, it bothers you that I can see through the game you're playing. Mitchell's face had lost all color. He glanced at his producer, who was now watching the exchange with a mix of concern and fascination. The interview had clearly veered far from their planned ambush. Vance rose from his chair, commanding the room with quiet authority. Before I go, I'd like to say one last thing to the American people watching at home. He turned to face the camera directly, his expression sincere and resolute. What you've witnessed today isn't just about one interview or one journalist's attempt to discredit me. It's about something much more important. It's about standing firm in your convictions even when the world tries to shame you for them. The studio was absolutely silent, hanging on his every word. Mitchell sat deflated, his stack of gotcha questions untouched. To every American who's been ridiculed for their faith, who's been mocked for their values, who's been told they're on the wrong side of history, stand strong. Because at the end of the day, character isn't about winning the approval of critics. It's about staying true to what you believe in. As Vance walked off the set, the audience rose in a standing ovation that seemed to shake the studio walls. Mitchell sat in the stunned silence, his carefully planned ambush thoroughly dismantled by a display of unwavering principle and quiet strength. Now it's your turn to reflect. When was a time you stood firm in your beliefs despite pressure to conform? Share your story in the comments below.